Tanith had been inside the Alpha King's palace for less than 3 hours when he stopped breathing. She hadn't been watching him. That was the first lie she told herself afterward, and she would keep telling it for weeks, because the truth was worse. The truth was that she hadn't been able to stop watching him since the moment she had walked through the feasting hall doors and found him sitting at the high table like a man carved from war and shadow. He was enormous. That was the first thing she noticed. Broad through the shoulders in a way that made the oak chair beneath him look like children's furniture. Dark hair, sharp jaw, a face built for severity. The kind of man who did not need a crown to make everyone in the room afraid. The crown just made it worse. Tanith was not supposed to be here. She was a village healer from Thornhaven, a settlement so far from the capital that most maps forgot to include it. 6 weeks ago, black vein fever had swept through a company of the king's soldiers camped near her village. 37 men, burning with fever. The military physicians had already declared half of them dead when Tanith had marched into their camp with a satchel of moonwort poultices and a complete disregard for anyone who told her to leave. She had saved every single one of them. The reward had been one evening at the palace during the autumn summit. One night among the nobles, a meal at the king's table, and the honor of being formally acknowledged by the crown. It was supposed to be the greatest night of her life. Instead, she was seated at the far end of the feasting hall, wedged between a duchess who smelled violently of rosewater and a lord who kept leaning across her to shout at someone 3 seats down. Nobody had spoken to her directly. The food was extraordinary, and she could not taste any of it because her entire body was vibrating with the awareness that the Alpha King was 40 feet away and she was breathing the same air. She was staring at him again. She could not help it. Something about his stillness drew her eye, the way he sat perfectly upright while everyone around him talked and laughed and drank. He was not participating. He was enduring. That is when she noticed his hand. It was resting on the table beside his goblet. His fingers had gone white, not pale, white. The kind of bloodless, frost-stripped white that she had only ever seen on frostbite patients pulled from snowdrifts in the dead of winter. Tanith's breath caught. She watched the white creep up past his wrist, disappearing beneath his sleeve. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath his eye. Nobody around him seemed to notice. They were too busy laughing at something the Duke across from him had said. Then his head dropped forward. It was subtle at first, just a slight dip that might have been a nod of acknowledgement. But his eyes had closed, and the hand on the table had gone completely rigid, fingers curled inward like they were frozen solid. The Duke paused mid-sentence. The woman beside the king reached toward him and then pulled back sharply, cradling her own fingers. "He's cold," someone whispered, loud enough for Tanith to hear. "Don't touch him, get Dareth." Tanith was already moving. She did not make the decision. Her legs made it for her. A lifetime of healing instinct overrode every rational thought in her head, and suddenly she was crossing the feasting hall, pushing past a servant carrying a wine decanter, weaving between chairs with a focus that felt like tunnel vision. A guard stepped into her path. She went around him. Another guard reached for her arm. She ducked under it. She reached the king and pressed her palm flat against his chest. The cold hit her like a wall. It punched through her hand and up her arm and seized her lungs in a grip so fierce she gasped out loud. For one terrible second she could not breathe. Then something shifted. Heat flooded out of her palm, pouring into his chest like water into cracked earth. She felt his heart stutter beneath her fingers. Once, twice. Then it caught, and his chest expanded with a ragged, desperate breath. His eyes flew open. Gray. Pale gray. Sharp and startled, and locked directly onto hers. Tanith was standing over the Alpha King with her hand pressed against his chest. His heart was beating against her palm. 40 nobles were staring at her. 2 guards had drawn their swords, and she had absolutely no explanation for what she had just done. "I'm a healer," she said, her voice coming out 3 octaves higher than normal. "I'm the healer, the one who saved the soldiers, the fever soldiers. Please don't execute me." Nobody spoke. The king's gaze had not moved from her face. His hand came up slowly and closed around her wrist. Not to remove it. To hold it there. "Who are you?" he asked. His tone was low and rough, and scraped against something deep inside her ribs. Before she could answer, a tall man with close-cropped silver hair appeared at the king's shoulder. Dareth, the beta. Tanith recognized him from the formal welcome ceremony 3 hours ago, back when she had still been a normal person having a normal evening. "Sire," Dareth said calmly, "perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere less public." The king released her wrist. The moment his fingers left her skin, Tanith watched the color drain from his hand again. He saw it too. His jaw clenched. "Don't let her leave," he said to Dareth, his gray eyes still fixed on Tanith. Dareth took her elbow with the gentle, immovable grip of a man who had escorted far more dangerous people to far less pleasant destinations. "Come with me, please," he said. Tanith's one promised evening at the palace was over. Or rather, it was supposed to be. Dareth led her to a small antechamber off the main corridor. Stone walls, a single candle, no windows. The kind of room where people received either very good news or very bad news, and the architecture strongly implied the latter. "Sit," Dareth said. Tanith sat. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her thighs and willed them to stop. "Am I in trouble?" she asked. "That depends," Dareth replied, "on what just happened." "I don't know what just happened," Tanith said honestly. "He was cold. I could see it from across the room. His hand went white, and then his head dropped, and nobody was doing anything, so I just—" She made a vague gesture. "Touched him." "You touched the king?" "Yes, without permission." "He was dying," Tanith said, her voice climbing. "At least that is what it looked like. His heart was barely beating. Was he not dying?" Dareth studied her for a long moment. His expression gave away nothing. "Wait here," he said, and left. Tanith sat alone in the candlelit room and contemplated every choice that had led her to this moment. She could have stayed home. She could have politely declined the palace invitation. She could have remained in her seat like a sensible person instead of sprinting across a crowded feasting hall to put her hands on the most powerful man in the realm. But no, she muttered to herself. Tanith had to go and put her hands all over the king. She pressed her palms over her eyes and groaned. When the door opened again, it was not Dareth. It was a woman in healer's robes, her auburn hair threaded with silver, her gaze sharp and assessing. She carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had spent decades telling powerful people things they did not want to hear. "I'm Marin," she said. "Chief healer. You're the girl from Thornhaven, the one who cured the black vein." Tanith managed. "And I didn't cure it. I treated it. There's a difference." Marin's mouth twitched. "I know the difference. That's why I'm interested in you." She pulled a chair close and sat down across from Tanith. "Tell me exactly what you felt when you touched the king." Tanith hesitated. "Cold," she said. "It was like pressing my hand against a block of ice. It went up my arm and into my chest, and I couldn't breathe for a second. And then," she paused, searching for the right words, "it reversed. Like the warmth just poured out of me and into him." "And how do you feel now?" Tanith blinked. She had not thought about it. She turned her attention inward and found, to her surprise, that she felt fine. Perfectly normal. Slightly warm even. "Fine," she said. Marin leaned back in her chair. Something complicated moved behind her eyes. "Wait here," she said, echoing Dareth's command, and left through the same door. Tanith was beginning to feel like a parcel that nobody wanted to sign for. Time passed. She could not tell how much. The candle burned lower. She picked at a loose thread on her borrowed dress and tried not to spiral. When the door opened a third time, it was Dareth again. "Come with me," he said. He led her through corridors she had not seen before. Upward, past the guest quarters, past the noble apartments, into a wing where the stone was older and the guards stood closer together. "Where are we going?" Tanith asked. "The king's study." Her stomach plummeted. "Is he going to yell at me?" Dareth glanced back at her. "The king doesn't yell. He goes quiet when he's angry. It's much worse." "That is not comforting," Tanith whispered. They reached a heavy oak door. Dareth opened it and gestured her inside. The study was large, warm, and lined with books and maps. A fire crackled in the hearth, and at the far end, behind a desk stacked with correspondence, sat King Varen. He was not looking at her. He was reading a letter, his pen moving in the margin with controlled, deliberate strokes. Tanith hovered near the door, acutely aware of how small she was in this room, in this palace, in this man's world. "Sit anywhere," Dareth murmured, guiding her to a chair near the bookshelves. "Don't speak unless he speaks to you." Tanith sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She tried to become invisible, which was difficult, given that the king's study was absolutely silent, and every breath she took sounded like a windstorm. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The king read. He made notes. He opened another letter. He showed no sign of knowing she existed. Her eyelids grew heavy. The fire was warm. The chair was deep. She had been awake since before dawn, traveling to the capital, and the adrenaline from the feasting hall was draining out of her like water through a sieve. She was watching the king's pen move across the page when she noticed it falter. A slight hitch. His hand paused, then resumed. 30 seconds later, it happened again. His pen stopped entirely. He set it down carefully and pressed his fingers against the edge of the desk. Tanith sat up straighter, her drowsiness forgotten. The king's hand was turning white. "No," she breathed. It happened faster this time. The pallor raced up his forearm, his jaw locked, his eyes lost focus. The pen rolled off the desk and clattered against the stone floor. Dareth moved immediately, but Tanith was closer. She crossed the room in 3 strides, her borrowed shoes slipping on the stone, and seized the king's hand in both of hers. The frost crashed into her again, brutal and absolute. She clenched her teeth against it and held on. Heat surged through her palms, and she watched the color flood back into his fingers, his wrist, his forearm. His chest expanded. His eyes cleared. He looked down at her hands wrapped around his, and then up at her face. "It happened again," he said, his tone low. "It happened again," Tanith confirmed, trying to keep her own voice from shaking. The king's gaze shifted to Dareth, who stood motionless by the door. Something unspoken passed between them. "The girl stays," the king said. "Your Majesty," Tanith started, her heart slamming against her ribs. "I was only promised 1 evening." His gray eyes returned to hers. "That arrangement has changed." The certainty in those words told her this was not a request. "Changed?" Tanith repeated. "Changed how?" Dareth answered for the king. "You'll be staying at the palace. A room will be prepared for you adjacent to His Majesty's chambers." Tanith stared at him, then at the king, then back at Dareth. "I have patients in Thornhaven. I have a home. I have a cat." "The cat can be retrieved," Dareth said. "That is not the point," Tanith said, her voice pitching upward in a way she couldn't control. "You can't just keep me here. I'm not a prisoner." "No one said prisoner," Dareth corrected. "The locked wing and the armed guards suggest otherwise." King Varen stood. The movement was slow and deliberate, and when he reached his full height, Tanith remembered with sudden visceral clarity how large he was. He rounded the desk and stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I'm asking," he said quietly. The word landed differently than she expected. There was no command in it, no royal authority, just exhaustion so deep it seemed to live in his bones. "How long has this been happening?" Tanith asked, searching his face. Up close, she could see what the distance and the crown had hidden: the hollowed cheeks, the bruised shadows under his eyes, the faint gray tinge to his skin that did not belong on a living man. "Long enough," the king replied. "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting tonight." They stared at each other. His jaw was set. Her chin was raised. Neither moved. "Fine," Tanith said, "but I want my cat." Something flickered across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite surprise. Something in between that softened the severe lines of his mouth for exactly half a second before vanishing. "Done," he said. Dareth showed her to her room, a modest chamber connected to the king's quarters by a heavy oak door that she was instructed to leave unlocked at all times. "In case of an episode," Dareth explained. "And if I need privacy?" Tanith asked. "You knock." "What if he needs privacy?" "He'll bolt it from his side." "So he gets a bolt, and I get an open door?" Dareth paused. "Would you like me to take this up with the king?" Tanith imagined that conversation and decided she would not. "No." She sat on the edge of the bed after Dareth left. The mattress was the softest thing she had ever touched. The sheets smelled of cedar and lavender. There was a window overlooking the palace gardens, and through it she could see the moon hanging low and heavy above the eastern wall. This was supposed to be temporary. One evening. A feast, a thank you, a story to tell back home. Instead, she was installed in the king's private wing with instructions to leave her door unlocked in case the most dangerous man in the realm started freezing to death in the middle of the night. A knock came from the connecting door. Tanith's pulse spiked. She smoothed her dress, crossed the room, and opened it. King Varen stood in the doorway in a loose linen shirt, his formal jacket gone, his hair slightly disheveled like he had been running his hands through it. Without the crown and the structured coat, he looked less like a king and more like a man who hadn't slept properly in a very long time. "The healer wants proximity tested overnight," he said, his tone clinical. "She believes your presence within a certain range may suppress the episodes during sleep." "Marin told you this?" "She's thorough." Tanith peered past him into his chambers. The room was vast, the bed enormous. She could see a low couch near the hearth, draped with a thick fur blanket. "I'll take the couch," she said quickly. "Obviously," the king replied, as though any other option had never crossed his mind. "Obviously," Tanith echoed, feeling her face heat for no reason she was willing to examine. She settled onto the couch with the fur blanket pulled up to her chin. The fire had been built high, and the room was warm. Too warm. She could hear the king across the room. The creak of the bed frame as he settled his weight. The slow exhale of a man who was bracing himself for another night of something terrible. "Do the episodes happen in your sleep?" she asked the darkness. A long pause. "Yes." "Every night?" Another pause. "Yes." Tanith pulled the blanket tighter. "Good night, Your Majesty." "Good night," he said, and the roughness in those 2 syllables did something complicated to her lungs that she firmly ignored. She lay awake listening to his breathing. It started controlled and measured, the deliberate rhythm of someone trying to will themselves into unconsciousness. Slowly, it deepened. The gaps between breaths grew longer. The tension she could feel radiating from across the room began to ease. He was falling asleep. Tanith closed her eyes and tried to follow him there. She was almost under when she heard it. A sharp intake of breath. A sound like grinding teeth. Then silence. The wrong kind. The kind that meant his breathing had stopped entirely. She threw the blanket off and crossed the room in the dark, navigating by memory and instinct. Her shin caught the edge of a table. She swallowed the yelp. Her hands found the bed, found him, found his arm. Ice. His skin was ice. She grabbed his hand and held on. The frost flooded through her, savage and absolute, and this time something came with it. A flash of light behind her eyes. Snow. A battlefield drenched in white. The sound of screaming so distant it might have been wind. A woman's voice, broken and ragged, cursing him in a language she did not understand. Then warmth. Heat pouring out of her and into him, dragging him back from wherever the frost had taken him. His fingers closed around hers, tight, desperate. His chest heaved with a shuddering breath. Tanith knelt beside his bed in the dark, her hand locked in the king's grip, her heart hammering, and tasted iron on her tongue. She had seen something she should not have. And she had the terrible feeling that whatever was killing the Alpha King was not a sickness at all. The routine settled over them like snowfall, slow and quiet and impossible to stop once it started. During the days, their lives did not touch. Tanith spent her mornings in the palace infirmary, where Marin had put her to work almost immediately. "If you're going to live here, you're going to be useful," the chief healer had said, and Tanith had been too relieved to argue. Useful was something she knew how to be. She treated guardsmen with sparring bruises and kitchen staff with burns, and a steady parade of minor nobility who seemed to develop mysterious ailments whenever they wanted attention. She organized Marin's herb stores, which were extensive but chaotically arranged, and she bit her tongue when she found the feverfew mixed in with the foxglove, because that was the kind of mistake that killed people. The king, meanwhile, ruled. She saw him sometimes through windows, crossing the courtyard flanked by advisors, or heard his voice echoing down a distant corridor, low and commanding. He existed in a different world during daylight hours, a world of maps and treaties and the crushing weight of a kingdom, and she existed in hers, and they did not overlap. But at night, everything changed. She would arrive at his chambers after the palace had gone quiet. The fire was always built high before she got there, though he never acknowledged doing it. A second fur blanket appeared on the couch one evening, thicker than the first. Then a proper pillow. Not the flat, sad thing she had been using, but one that actually supported her neck. She said nothing about any of it. Then a book appeared on the small table beside the couch. A treatise on alpine medicinal flora that she had mentioned wanting to read 3 nights ago in passing, while rambling about the differences between highland and lowland chamomile. "Thank you for the book," she said that evening as she settled onto the couch. The king did not look up from the letter he was reading. "What book?" "The one you definitely did not leave for me." A pause. "Go to sleep, Tanith." She smiled into the dark. The talking had started by accident. The first few nights the silence had been unbearable. She could hear every creak of the old palace, every gust of wind against the windows, and worst of all, she could hear him, the restless, shifting, the controlled breathing that never quite relaxed, the occasional sharp inhale that made her bolt upright, certain an episode was coming. So she had started talking. Not about anything important, just small things. Stories from Thornhaven. The merchant who had tried to sell her genuine phoenix feather tonic that turned out to be dyed turkey quills dissolved in cheap wine. The time a farmer had brought his goat to her because it was coughing, and she had spent 20 minutes examining the animal before realizing the farmer was the one who was sick, and he had simply brought the goat for moral support. She did not know when he stopped shifting and started listening, but she knew he was listening because one morning, as she was heading for the connecting door, he said, without looking up from tying his boots, "The goat. Did it at least enjoy the examination?" Tanith had stared at him, startled and oddly moved. "She seemed to," Tanith managed. "More than most of my human patients, honestly." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had committed more fully to the effort. Tanith carried it with her for the rest of the day like a stolen treasure. 3 weeks in, Marin called her into the back room of the infirmary. The episodes are decreasing in frequency, Marin said, spreading a chart across the workbench. But they haven't stopped entirely. He still has at least one per night, usually in the deepest hours. I know, Tanith said. I can feel when they start. The room gets colder. Marin studied her. You feel the temperature change from across the room? It wakes me up. Every time. Something passed behind Marin's eyes that Tanith couldn't read. The episodes correlate with distance, Marin continued carefully. The data suggests that closer physical proximity during sleep would reduce their frequency further, possibly eliminate them entirely. Tanith processed this. You want me to sleep closer to him? In the bed, Marin said. With him. Tanith's face went hot. Absolutely not. This is medical. This is insane. He is dying, Tanith. The words hit like ice water. Because she knew. She knew it every time she held his hand and felt the frost in his veins. She knew it every morning when she saw the gray tinge beneath his skin that was a shade darker than the day before. Fine, she whispered. That evening, she stood in the king's chambers staring at the bed like it was a sentencing. Marin spoke to you, Varen said. It was not a question. She did. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands braced on his knees. He looked almost as uncomfortable as she felt, which was both reassuring and completely unhelpful. You don't have to, he said. I know. If you'd rather not. I said I know. She took a breath. Move over. He did, shifting to the far side of the bed with a precision that suggested he had calculated the maximum possible distance between two people sharing a mattress. Tanith lay down on the very edge, her body rigid, her arms pressed flat against her sides. The bed was enormous. And yet, somehow there wasn't enough room because his presence filled every corner of it the way his presence filled every room. She could feel the warmth of him from 2 feet away, which struck her as deeply ironic for a man whose blood ran cold. You are very tense, he observed. I am lying in the Alpha King's bed. Tension seems appropriate. A pause. Fair. Silence settled. The fire crackled. She could hear him breathing, steady and deliberate, and she could feel the exact moment it began to change, deepening, slowing, the rigid control loosening one thread at a time. He was falling asleep. Tanith reached across the dark and found his hand. His fingers flinched at the contact, then curled around hers. His palm was cool, not cold, not frozen, just cool, like river water in late spring. She squeezed gently. He squeezed back. His breathing deepened further, and within minutes, the tension drained from his body entirely. He slept through the night. No episodes, no ice, no grinding teeth or stopped breathing or desperate gasps in the dark. Just deep, steady, peaceful sleep from dusk until the first pale light of morning crept through the curtains. Tanith lay beside him, his hand in hers. Sometime before dawn, his fingers tightened around hers and he murmured a single word into the dark. Her name. She woke to warmth. Not the gentle warmth of morning sunlight or the residual heat of a banked fire. This was enveloping, total, pressed against every inch of her. Tanith's eyes opened slowly, and her brain needed several seconds to process the information her body was providing. She was on her side. The king was behind her, curved around her like a shield. His arm was draped across her waist, heavy and possessive. His chest was warm against her back, and she could feel his heartbeat, slow and strong and steady, against her shoulder blade. His face was buried in her hair, and each exhale sent warmth cascading down the back of her neck. At some point during the night, he had pulled her in, and at some point during the night, she had let him. Tanith held absolutely still and tried to think rationally. This was meaningless. He was asleep. His body had sought warmth in the dark the way any cold thing gravitates toward heat. It was instinct, not intention, and she was a fool for the way her heart was hammering and her wolf was practically purring beneath her skin. Her wolf. That was new. 23 years of life, and her wolf had been a quiet, docile presence, barely noticeable. Now it was suddenly awake and alert, and straining toward the man behind her with a single-minded focus that bordered on obsessive. Tanith tried to shift away. His arm tightened. A low sound rumbled through his chest, something between a growl and a protest, and he pulled her closer, tucking her more firmly against him. She bit the inside of her cheek and stared at the far wall and tried very hard not to think about the fact that his arm had tightened around her waist, holding her close even in sleep. Then she felt him wake. It was instant. The moment consciousness returned, his entire body went rigid. She felt the hitch in his breathing, felt the precise second he realized where his arm was, where his face was, where she was. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then he did something she did not expect. Instead of pulling away, he drew a slow, deliberate breath through her hair. She heard the soft catch in his throat, felt his arm tighten around her, not pulling her closer, just holding, like he was memorizing the feeling. Then he was gone. He withdrew so abruptly the mattress lurched. She heard his feet hit the floor, heard him cross the room, heard the dressing room door close with careful, controlled precision. Tanith lay in the tangled sheets and pressed her hands over her burning face. The bond symptoms began that day. She did not recognize them at first. She attributed the headache to poor sleep. The chill that settled into her fingers during her morning shift in the infirmary was just the cold stone of the palace, she told herself. The constant pull she felt toward the east wing where his study was coincidence. But by the 3rd day, she couldn't ignore it. Her hands were cold all the time now, not frost white, not like his episodes. Just a persistent chill that lived in her fingers and climbed to her wrists. She wore gloves during her shifts and told Marin she had poor circulation. Marin had given her a look that said she was not fooled, but would wait. The nights grew harder. They held hands across the divide of the mattress, maintaining the careful distance they had silently agreed upon, and he slept deeply beside her, and she lay awake and ached. Her wolf ached. That was the worst part. It pressed against her ribs with a longing that had no language, no logic, just need. On the 5th night, he had a nightmare. Tanith felt it before she heard it. A drop in temperature so sudden it woke her instantly. She rolled toward him and found his hand in the dark. The frost crashed through her, worse than before, and this time the visions were not a flash. She was there, a village in winter, smoke rising from burning rooftops, snow darkened with the toll of battle, soldiers in the king's colors moving through the streets, and the screaming was not distant this time, it was everywhere. She could smell the char and the iron. She could feel the heat of the fires against her face while the curse froze her from the inside. A child ran past her, barefoot in the snow, clutching something to her chest. Tanith reached for her, but her hand passed through the girl like smoke. Then it was over. She gasped back into the dark bedroom, her lungs burning, her fingers locked around the king's hand. Something was wrong. She looked down at their joined hands and her stomach dropped. Frost. Delicate white crystals spreading across her knuckles, tracing the lines of her veins beneath the skin. She stared at it, transfixed, watching the frost creep toward her wrist. It took almost a full minute to fade, the crystals dissolving into dampness that evaporated against her skin. But for that minute, her hand had looked exactly like his during an episode. Tanith. She startled. The king was awake, sitting up in bed staring at her hand. The horror on his face was absolute. "It's nothing," she said quickly, pulling her hand behind her back. "Just condensation. The room is cold." "Don't lie to me." His words were raw. He reached for her wrist and turned her hand over, examining her fingers. The frost was gone, but the skin was still pale, still faintly blue at the nail beds. "It's transferring to you," he said, and the way he said it, quiet and certain and devastated, told her he had feared this all along. "We don't know that," Tanith began. "Go back to Thornhaven." She blinked. "What?" "Tonight." He released her hand like it burned him. He stood and moved to the window, putting the maximum distance between them. "Pack your things. Dareth will arrange an escort." "You can't be serious." He refused to turn around. His shoulders were rigid. His hands gripped the window ledge, and even from across the room, she could see the white spreading across his knuckles. "It's an order," he said. "I'm not one of your soldiers." "Then consider it a request." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes stopped her cold. It was not anger. It was terror. "Please, Tanith, please go." She opened her mouth to argue, but the desperation in his voice, the way it cracked on her name, stole every word she had. She left his chambers without another word. The door closed behind her, and she stood alone in her borrowed room, her cold fingers pressed against her heart, and felt the first crack form in something she had not realized she was building. He did not send her to Thornhaven. That would have required seeing her again, and the king, it seemed, had decided that looking at Tanith was no longer something he was willing to do. Instead, she was moved to guest quarters in the south wing. Clean and comfortable, and so far from his chambers that she might as well have been in a different kingdom. Dareth delivered the news with his usual measured calm. "It's temporary," the beta said, though his expression suggested he did not believe his own words. "How long?" Tanith asked. "Until the king decides otherwise." She wanted to scream. She wanted to march to his study and demand an explanation that made sense. But the frost was still in her memory, the crystal patterns spreading across her knuckles, and she could still see the terror in his eyes when he had looked at her hand. He was afraid, not of her, for her. That made it worse. The chill came for her on the second day. Not an episode, not the violent seizing freeze that gripped the king. This was subtler, a persistent ache that settled into her bones and refused to leave. She piled blankets on her bed. She wore 2 pairs of wool stockings. She sat so close to the fireplace that Marin scolded her for singeing her skirts. Nothing helped. By the 4th day, her fingers were blue at the tips. She hid them in her sleeves and blamed poor circulation. By the 6th day, the headaches returned, sharp and splitting, like something frozen was pressing against the inside of her skull. She caught glimpses of him, a tall figure crossing the far end of a corridor. A shadow at the window of his study when she crossed the courtyard. He was always moving away from her, always turning a corner before she could reach it, and the distance between them felt like a living thing that grew heavier with every hour. He looked worse. Even from afar she could see it. The gray in his skin had deepened. His movements had lost their fluid precision. He walked like a man carrying something enormous and invisible, and she wanted to help him carry it, and he wouldn't let her. The palace whispered. It always did. She heard fragments in corridors and stairwells. The king had 3 episodes during a single council meeting. The king's hands froze to a document, and the servants had to pour warm water over his fingers to free them. The king collapsed in the armory, and Dareth had to carry him to his chambers. Each rumor hit her like a fist. Her wolf was frantic now, not restless, frantic. It paced inside her with a desperation that made her physically nauseous. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep without dreaming of cold, endless cold, and a heartbeat slowing to silence. On the 7th day, Marin cornered her in the infirmary. "Show me your hands," the healer demanded. Tanith hesitated, then pulled her sleeves back. Marin took one look at the blue-tinged fingertips and the web of pale frost lines tracing her veins and let out a sharp breath. "How long?" Marin asked. "It started the day he sent me away." "And you didn't think to mention this?" He doesn't want me near him, Marin. He thinks proximity is making it worse. Being away from you is making everything worse, Marin snapped. For both of you. But before Marin could say more, a bell rang from the upper corridors. 2 sharp notes, the signal for a council summons. Marin was needed upstairs. Tanith followed, drawn by an instinct she could no longer resist. They reached the council chamber corridor just as the doors opened. Advisors filed out, their faces tight with something between concern and fear. Through the gap in the doorway, Tanith saw him. Varen was standing at the head of the council table, one hand braced against the wood, his head bowed. His other hand hung at his side, and even from 20 feet away she could see the frost crawling up his fingers, the blue-white creeping past his wrist. His jaw was clenched so hard the tendons stood out in his neck. He was fighting it, alone, refusing to go down in front of his people. Tanith's vision swam. The ice inside her surged, rising from her belly to her throat. Her knees buckled. She reached for the wall and missed. The stone floor rushed toward her, and the last thing she saw before the world went white was Varen's face turning toward her, his expression shattering. She heard her name. Not her title, not the healer, not the girl. Her name, ripped from his throat with a sound that was more wolf than man, then arms around her, lifting her. Frost-cold arms, but holding her like she was the only warm thing left in the world. She felt herself pressed against his chest, felt his heart slamming beneath her ear, felt the shuddering breath he drew as he carried her down the corridor, and she heard the growl he directed at anyone who stepped too close. She drifted, warm and cold in equal measure, safe and terrified in the same breath. When she opened her eyes, she was in the infirmary. Marin stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, expression grim. And Varen sat beside her, his head in his hands, frost still clinging to his sleeves where he had held her. "You should not have touched her," Marin said to the king, her words quiet but edged. "She was falling," he replied without looking up. His voice was wrecked. "She is falling because you sent her away." Marin moved closer. "The cold you carry, she has been absorbing it every time she pulls you from an episode. It lives in her now. At close range, your bond counterbalances it, keeps it in check. But at a distance, it grows unchecked. You are not protecting her by pushing her away, Your Majesty. You are killing her." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Tanith had ever heard. "Tell me about the curse," Marin continued. "The truth this time, all of it." Varen did not move for a long time. Then he straightened. His face was composed, but his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled in his lap. "Solveig," he said, "a winter witch from the Ashenmere borderlands. Her people raided our settlements for 2 seasons. We tried negotiation, we tried treaties. They killed our peace envoys." He stopped, swallowed. Her son led the final assault on Crestfall village. 43 civilians died. Women. Children. His words had gone flat, the way words go when the only alternative is breaking. "I led the counterattack. Her son died in the fighting. Solveig found me after. Already dying from a wound no healing could close. She grabbed my wrist and cursed me with her last breath." He paused. "Every heartbeat colder than the last," she said. "Until there is nothing warm left in you. Until you know what it is to watch your own blood freeze." Tanith reached for his hand. He pulled away. "The curse should be weakening by now," Marin said, frowning. "Deathbed curses from lesser witches don't sustain for over a year without fuel. Something is feeding it." "Does it matter?" Varen asked, his tone empty. "Even if we break it, I've already poisoned her." "You haven't poisoned me," Tanith whispered. He finally looked at her. The anguish in his gray eyes was so raw it made her lungs ache. "Your hands are blue, Tanith," he said softly. "Your hands are blue because of me." He stood and walked out without another word. Marin waited until his footsteps faded before turning to Tanith. The bond between you is forming whether he accepts it or not, Marin said. The cold you carry will keep growing as long as the curse lives. If the bond completes before the curse breaks, it will kill you both. Tanith stared at her. And if I stay away from him? Marin's expression was the gentlest and most terrible thing she had ever seen. Then you die faster, the healer said. And he dies alone. Tanith did not sleep that night. She lay in the guest quarters with the blankets pulled to her chin and the chill crawling through her veins and made a decision. She was done waiting for permission. She had spent her entire life waiting for permission. Permission to exist, to take up space, to matter. She had been left on the steps of a healer's cottage when she was 3 days old. No name pinned to her blanket. No letter. No explanation. Just a baby in the cold and the unspoken message that she was not worth staying for. And so she had made herself useful. Useful to the village. Useful to her patients. Useful to everyone because useful was the only thing that justified her presence. She had been useful to the king, too, a convenient solution to his convenient problem. And the moment she became inconvenient, the moment helping him came with a cost, he had sent her away. She understood why. She understood that he was trying to protect her, that the terror in his eyes had been real and the guilt in his voice genuine. But understanding did not change the fact that she was lying in a cold bed, slowly freezing from the inside, while the man she loved was dying alone on the other side of the palace. Loved. The word settled over her like a held breath. She did not try to take it back. Tanith threw the covers off, put on her boots, and walked out of her room. No escort, no summons, no permission. The corridors were dark and empty. Her footsteps echoed off the stone. 2 guards at the base of the king's stairwell moved to block her path. The king has ordered that no one disturb him, the taller one said. I'm not no one, Tanith replied. I'm his healer. Miss, we have strict instructions. And I have frostbite in my fingers because your king is too stubborn to let me do my job. She held up her hands. The blue at her fingertips was visible even in the dim torchlight. Do you want to explain to Dareth why you let me lose my hands? Because I promise you, Marin will have your posts by morning. The guards exchanged a look. The taller one stepped aside. Tanith climbed the stairs with her heart in her throat. His door was unlocked. That surprised her. She had expected bolts and barriers, some physical manifestation of the wall he had built between them. But the handle turned easily, and the door swung open onto darkness. The fire had burned to embers. The room was freezing, not palace in winter cold. Supernaturally cold. The kind of cold that made her breath crystallize in front of her face. Varn was sitting on the edge of his bed, his head bowed, his hands hanging between his knees. The frost covered his arms to the elbows. His shirt was stiff with ice, and he was shaking, fine tremors running through his massive frame, his body fighting a war it was slowly losing. Tanith. He said her name without looking up, like he had sensed her the moment she crossed the threshold. Go away. No. He lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot. His lips were tinged blue. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something vast and dark and final. I can't keep you safe, he said. The words were barely a whisper. I can't even keep myself alive. What kind of king can't protect one person? The kind who's too busy trying to carry everything alone. Tanith crossed the room and stopped in front of him. It isn't safe for me to stay away. Marin told you that. The frost is in me now whether you like it or not. Pushing me away doesn't undo what's already happened. It just means we both freeze separately instead of staying warm together. Tanith, I'm not leaving. You should. I don't care what I should do. Her voice cracked and she let it. I care about what I need to do. And I need to be here. Not because I'm useful. Not because I'm your cure. but because every minute away from you feels like drowning in ice water and I cannot breathe. Varen, I cannot breathe without you. His name, not his title. She watched it land, watched the way his entire body flinched like she had struck him. You used my name, he said, because you're not just a king to me. You know that. He stared at her. The frost on his arms was receding, pulling back from the boundary of her warmth like a tide. I know, he said, and his voice broke on the second word. I have known since the first night you held my hand in the dark, and I slept without dreaming for the first time in over a year. I have known since I woke with you in my arms, and it was the closest thing to peace I have ever felt. I know what you are to me, Tanith. That is exactly why I am terrified. She reached for his face, her cold fingers against his cold skin, and where they touched, warmth bloomed, spreading outward like dawn. Then be terrified with me, she whispered. But don't be terrified alone. He kissed her, or she kissed him. It did not matter which, because the moment their mouths met, the ice shattered. Heat flooded between them, through them, a current of warmth so powerful it stole the breath from her lungs. His hands came up to cradle her face, tilting her exactly where he wanted her, and she felt the desperation in his grip, the months of restraint crumbling in a single instant. He pulled her close. She went willingly, her fingers tangling in his hair. He lifted her effortlessly and carried her to the bed, laying her down with a gentleness that contradicted the urgency in his kiss. She held on to him, needing his closeness, needing the warmth of him beside her. What followed was the most overwhelming moment of her life. The warmth between them built until it felt like the room itself was burning. When the bond snapped into place, it hit them both at once, a lock turning, a key finding home, and Tanith gasped as warmth flooded every cell of her body. He marked her. The bite at the curve of her neck sent a shockwave through the bond that she felt in her teeth. She marked him back, claiming him with equal ferocity, and his answering groan vibrated through her bones. The bond settled, golden and humming and complete. They lay tangled together afterward, his arm wrapped around her, her head on his chest. His heartbeat was steady, strong, warm. For the first time since the curse, his skin was warm. Stay, he murmured against her hair. Always, she whispered. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and the world was quiet, and the frost was gone. Tanith opened her eyes and tasted ice. The world was white. Not fog. Ice. Everything was encased in it. The trees, the ground, the sky itself seemed frozen, a pale expanse of nothing that stretched in every direction. The air was so cold it burned her lungs with every breath. Tanith stood barefoot on frozen ground and knew exactly where she was. His prison. The place the curse dragged him to every night. The place he had been fighting alone for over a year. She had seen flashes of it through his nightmares, but this was different. The bond was complete now, and she was not catching fragments. She was standing inside it. Varen, she called. Her voice cracked against the frozen air and fell dead at her feet. No echo, no resonance. The ice swallowed sound the way it swallowed everything. She found him at the center of a frozen lake. He was on his knees, his hands flat against the surface, staring downward. And beneath the ice, preserved in perfect, terrible clarity, were the dead. Hundreds of them. Soldiers and civilians, wolves and humans, frozen mid-expression. Some with their mouths open in silent screams, some with their eyes closed, almost peaceful, some reaching upward, their hands pressed against the underside of the ice like they were trying to break through. Tanith's stomach heaved. She pressed her hand over her mouth and forced herself forward. The ice beneath her bare feet was smooth and impossibly cold, and with every step she could feel faces beneath her, eyes staring up through the frozen surface. Varen. She knelt beside him. We need to leave. He did not respond. His eyes were fixed on the ice beneath his hands. She followed his gaze and her breath stopped. A girl, small, maybe 7 or 8 years old, barefoot, clutching a cloth doll to her chest. Her face was frozen in an expression of bewildered trust, as though she had been running toward safety and the world had simply stopped. Tanith recognized her, the child from the vision in his nightmare, the one she had reached for and could not touch. Nessa, Varen whispered, and the name came out shattered. The bond flared and Tanith saw everything: the counterattack on Crestfall, the chaos, soldiers pushing through the burning village to reach the enemy position, Varen shouting orders to protect the civilians, to get them behind the lines. And this girl, this small barefoot girl, running toward his soldiers because she thought they were rescue. The arrow was not meant for her. It was not meant for anyone. It was a stray, a piece of chaos, a splinter of violence with no name and no target. But it found her anyway, and Varen reached her too late, held her as she went still, carried her back through the ruined village in silence. She ran to me, Varen said, his voice hollow. She thought I would save her. You tried, Tanith said, tears streaming down her face. Trying wasn't enough. The frozen figures began to shift. Not moving, not thawing, but somehow present. Their eyes found him through the ice. Their mouths formed words she could almost hear. And though no sound came, she felt the weight of them pressing down on his shoulders like stones. This is what the curse does, Tanith said, understanding crashing over her. It freezes them here so you can never look away. It makes you carry every single one of them forever. They deserve to be carried, Varen said. They deserve to be released. She grabbed his arm. You think you deserve this. You think the frost is payment for what happened. That is why the curse keeps growing, Varen. Not because the witch was powerful. Because you keep feeding it. Every night you come here and you agree with it. He shook his head. You don't understand. I do understand. Her voice broke, but she kept going. I was left on the steps of a healer's cottage when I was 3 days old. No name, no letter, nothing. Just a baby in a basket and nobody who wanted her. His eyes finally left the ice and found hers. I spent my entire life believing I deserved it, Tanith continued, the words pouring out of her raw and unfiltered. That if I had been better somehow, different somehow, someone would have stayed. So I made myself useful, because useful was the only thing that gave me the right to exist. Every patient I healed, every life I saved, I was trying to earn a place in a world that threw me away before I could open my eyes. She was sobbing now, ugly and real, and the tears froze on her cheeks almost instantly. But it was a lie, Varen. I was 3 days old. There was nothing I could have done differently. And you were a king fighting a war you did not start to protect people who had no one else. Nessa's death was not your failure. It was the cruelty of war falling on the one person who least deserved it. And you have been punishing yourself for something that was never yours to carry alone. The ice beneath them groaned, a long, deep sound like the earth itself was shifting. Let them go, Tanith said, gripping his hands. Let them rest. Let yourself rest. You are allowed to put this down. Varen stared at her. The rawness in his face was almost unbearable. He looked down at the frozen girl beneath the ice, his hand pressed flat against the surface above her face. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry I couldn't reach you in time. I'm sorry for all of it. The crack started small, a single line, thin as a hair, radiating outward from his palm. Then another, and another. The frozen lake began to fracture, splitting into a web of golden light as warmth, real warmth, fierce and alive, poured through the cracks from below. The dead began to thaw, not violently, gently. The ice around them dissolved into light, and one by one they rose, not as ghosts, not as accusations, as warmth. Points of golden light that drifted upward into the white sky like embers from a dying fire. Nessa was last. The ice around her melted slowly, carefully, and for just a moment, the little girl's frozen expression softened into something peaceful. Her eyes closed. She released the doll, and she became light. The frozen world shattered. Tanith gasped awake in the king's bed, her heart pounding, warmth flooding every inch of her body. Beside her, Varen was awake, his eyes wide and wet and filled with something she had never seen in them before. Hope. He reached for her face, his thumb brushing away the tears that were still falling, and when he spoke, his voice was steady for the first time in over a year. "It's warm," he said, pressing her hand flat against his chest. "Tanith, feel. It's warm." His heartbeat beneath her palm. Strong, steady, warm. Tanith laughed through her tears and pulled him close and held on. The curse did not shatter cleanly. Nothing that deep ever does. Varen still woke cold some mornings, the frost lingering at his fingertips like a habit his body could not quite unlearn. He still flinched at sudden sounds. Still carried the names of the dead somewhere behind his ribs where the ice had lived the longest. But Tanith was there, every morning. And the chill retreated a little further each time. Healing came slowly. He learned to talk about the war, not all at once, not easily, but in pieces. Sitting beside the fire with her legs across his lap, his thumb tracing absent circles on her ankle. "You're allowed to remember them," she told him one night. "You're allowed to grieve, but you're also allowed to be warm." The court adjusted with considerable whispering. A foundling village healer as the Alpha King's mate was not what the nobility had envisioned. The whispers followed Tanith through every corridor and formal dinner where she used the wrong fork and did not care. "They'll come around," Varen murmured against her temple on their wedding night, holding her close. "And if they don't, they can bring their complaints to their king, who would sooner abdicate than hear a word spoken against his mate." Her cat arrived from Thornhaven the following week. It promptly claimed the king's favorite chair and refused to move. Varen pretended to be irritated. The cat was not fooled. Months later, on a quiet morning in late spring, Tanith woke to pale sunlight and birdsong through the open window. Varen was still asleep beside her. His face was peaceful. His breathing was deep and even. His skin was warm beneath the sheets, and his hand rested over hers on the pillow between them. No frost, no cold, no frozen world waiting beneath his eyelids. Tanith pressed her palm gently against his chest, the same place she had first touched him in a crowded feasting hall, terrified and desperate and certain she was about to be executed. She smiled, closed her eyes, and let the warmth carry her back to sleep. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next one.